A millionaire invites his humble ex-girlfriend to his wedding, but what happens next shocks everyone. The meeting room of the most exclusive hotel in New York was wrapped in luxury, reflecting the grandeur of the event being planned. Emily, impeccable in a couture dress, flipped through fabric samples with the precision of someone treating the wedding as a spectacle. James, sitting just a few meters away, watched silently, distracted by the opulent sparkle of the engagement ring Emily proudly displayed. "The main hall will be perfect," she said without lifting her eyes. "It's big enough to accommodate everyone who matters." James nodded automatically, not really absorbing what Emily was saying. His mind wandered to the real purpose of the wedding, solidifying alliances between two powerful families. Despite all the pomp, something about this process felt empty, mechanical. "We need to talk about the guest list," Emily said, interrupting James's wandering thoughts. "I want to include Laura." James froze. The name Laura, his ex-girlfriend, felt like a shock amid their routine conversation about flowers and decorations. "Laura? Why?" he frowned, clearly uncomfortable. Emily smiled, but her eyes gleamed with an almost malicious edge. "Why not? She's part of your past. I thought it would be interesting for her to see what you've accomplished." The provocation in Emily's voice was clear. James knew his fiancée well. She was shrewd and manipulative when she wanted to be. He recognized this as a strategy to reinforce her superiority, to underline her position as the woman who won in the competition for his love. However, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the mention of Laura brought a flood of memories. Laura and James had been inseparable in another life, before bigger ambitions had pushed him into Emily's world. With Laura, everything had been simple and genuine, from strolls in the park to late-night conversations about shared dreams. The world he had built afterward felt like an unfair trade. "That's unnecessary," he said, finally breaking the silence. "It's just an invitation, James." "Don't make it seem so dramatic," Emily retorted, crossing her arms. The tension in the room was palpable. James tried to look away, but Emily, with her commanding posture, dominated the space. He knew that arguing with her would only prolong the discomfort, and the last thing he wanted was another endless argument about things that mattered more to her than to him. "Fine," he sighed, "but don't ask me to like it." Later, in his office, James stared at the phone in silence. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to Laura. The weight of what he had left behind seemed heavier now, compounded by the memory of her easy smile and the way she lit up any room she was in. Finally, he summoned the courage to dial. The wait felt endless until a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Laura, it's James," he began, his throat dry. "I know it's been a while since we last talked, but I'm calling to invite you to my wedding." The silence on the other end of the line was more eloquent than any immediate response. When Laura finally spoke, her voice was calm, yet carried a note of surprise. "Your wedding," she repeated, as though testing the weight of the words. "Of course, I appreciate the invitation." James could feel the hesitation, the subtle shock she was trying to conceal, and in that moment he questioned whether he was making a mistake by going along with Emily's suggestion. There was something cruel about reopening doors he had locked away so long ago. "I hope you come." He barely recognized his own voice, so soft and uncertain. I'll think about it," Laura said, ending the call gently. Laura stared at the phone for long minutes after James's call ended. His voice, deeper and more hesitant than she remembered, still echoed in her mind. "I'm calling to invite you to my wedding." It was a phrase she never thought she would hear. The initial shock quickly gave way to a flood of conflicting thoughts. Why was he inviting her? Was it his idea or Emily's? The invitation seemed more like a provocation than a genuine gesture. The light of the setting sun filtered through the window of Laura's small studio, where canvases and brushes filled every corner. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of coffee, and the tranquility of the room contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside her. After years of living in Austin, Laura had built a life that, though simple, was filled with meaning that she had created herself. Becoming a visual artist had been a lifelong dream, and even though she was still far from widespread recognition, she felt fulfilled seeing her works begin to attract local attention. "He wants me to go," she murmured to herself, as if testing the idea. Deep down, she knew Emily was behind this. The woman had always had a peculiar way of demonstrating her superiority, and an invitation to the wedding seemed exactly like something she would do. Yet Laura also understood that there was more at stake. Accepting or declining meant facing or running away from the past, and she didn't want to be defined by decisions made so many years ago. Hours later, Laura met Sarah at a cafe near the main square. Sarah, her best friend since her early days in Austin, was a free spirit with blunt opinions, qualities that Laura admired and at times feared. "Are you serious?" Sarah asked, slamming her coffee cup on the table more forcefully than intended. "He invites you to his wedding with that woman, and you're thinking of going?" "I haven't decided yet," Laura replied, slowly stirring her tea, barely touched. "But it's not as simple as it seems." Sarah raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "Not simple?" "Laura, this screams trap. They just want to humiliate you, especially her. Don't give them the satisfaction." "What if I go to prove it doesn't affect me?" Laura countered, her voice firmer now. "I'm not that insecure girl he left behind anymore. My life is mine. I don't need their approval." Sarah sighed, realizing that Laura was determined to go despite her reservations. "I just hope you're doing this for yourself, not to show them something." In the following days, Laura threw herself into preparations, trying to transform her decision into an opportunity to reaffirm who she had become. While visiting a small boutique in the city center, she found a dress that seemed to encapsulate everything she wanted to convey. It was elegant, but understated, with a cut that highlighted her confidence without being ostentatious. The deep blue hue reminded her of the calm she had sought in her new life. Looking at herself in the mirror, Laura saw something she hadn't noticed in a long time. A strong woman, one capable of facing the past without being consumed by it. If you're watching until here, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. The banquet hall at Liberty Castle gleamed like a scene from a fairy tale, a luxurious testament to the power and prestige of Emily's family. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, reflecting light in delicate patterns across the marble floor. Exuberant floral arrangements in shades of white and gold adorned every corner, while impeccably dressed waiters moved silently through the room, carrying trays of champagne. The elite of New York had gathered, wearing their finest attire, and engaging in conversations that blended elegance with superficiality. James leaned against one of the grand columns, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the hall with a lost expression. Even in a perfectly tailored suit, he felt out of place. His eyes searched for something or someone, but he wasn't sure exactly what. Emily, stunning in a white dress that seemed made for a queen, glided through the room, greeting guests with a rehearsed smile. When Laura crossed through the main gates, accompanied by the hushed murmurs of security, the atmosphere shifted. The sound of conversation dwindled to whispers as all eyes turned toward her. The deep blue dress that embraced her body with elegance made her presence stand out, but it was never excessive. Laura walked confidently, her eyes fixed ahead, undistracted by the attention she was drawing. Yet every step she took was an internal battle. Laura's heart raced, but she maintained a serene, almost defiant expression. Every curious glance or subtle judgment she sensed only fueled her resolve. She knew many there were questioning her presence, and perhaps that was the point. When James finally saw her, it felt as though time had stopped. He swallowed hard, the surprise evident on his face. Laura looked like a vision from another reality, one he thought he had left behind. She approached slowly, and James took a step toward her, unable to contain the impulse. "Laura," he said, with a nervous smile that couldn't hide the impact her presence had on him. "You came." "James," she replied, with a small smile that mixed cordiality with distance. "Thank you for the invitation. The wedding is impressive." Before he could respond, Emily appeared beside him, her presence as commanding as Laura's, but carrying a different energy. Her eyes assessed Laura from head to toe, a smile on her lips that resembled a weapon. "What a surprise to see you here, Laura," Emily said, her voice sweet but laced with sarcasm. "I didn't imagine you'd accept the invitation. I hope you're comfortable among so many different people." Laura didn't lose her composure. "Quite comfortable, thank you, Emily. The place is stunning. A wedding like this truly reflects who you are." Emily narrowed her eyes, sensing the subtle provocation. James, caught between the two, seemed bewildered. He didn't know whether to intervene or let the situation unfold. Before he could decide, Emily turned to a nearby group of guests and, deliberately loud enough to be heard, said, "It's always nice to see old friends, especially those who remain simple, even with time." Laura merely smiled. "Simplicity has its beauty, Emily. Sometimes it's exactly what's missing in our world." The guests around them exchanged surprised glances, some even stifling smiles. It was clear that Laura wasn't someone easily intimidated. Her calmness and elegance began to attract more attention than the bride and groom themselves. As Emily walked away, visibly irritated, James remained still, torn between the impact of Laura's presence and the growing tension in the air. Laura, on the other hand, continued to mingle with other guests naturally, earning admiring glances. The soft music of the orchestra filled the hall, but it couldn't mask the growing murmurs about Laura. She had unexpectedly become the center of attention, something Emily had not planned for. As guests continued to interact with her, drawn to her confident and authentic demeanor, Emily felt her control over the night slipping through her fingers. In a more secluded corner, Emily approached a small group of guests, where Laura was discussing a recent exhibition in Austin. The attention the listeners gave to every word irritated her deeply. When she noticed that one of the most influential businessmen in the city was among them, something inside Emily snapped. "Laura, how interesting to hear about your art," Emily interrupted with a sharp smile. "But don't you miss something more? Stable. I've always found it so hard to live off something as uncertain as art." The guests exchanged discreet glances, sensing the venom hiding beneath the polite words. Laura, however, remained unshaken. With a calm smile, she responded, "It depends on what you consider stability, Emily. For me, stability is knowing that I'm doing what I love every day. But I understand that priorities may differ for each person." The response was so composed and well-placed that it completely disarmed the provocation. The businessman laughed, clearly impressed. "That's what I call true passion. Few people have the courage to live like that nowadays." Emily pressed her lips together, trying to maintain composure as her discomfort grew. With Laura standing out in such an unexpected way, she felt the need to act once more, this time with a more direct tone. "It's admirable, of course." Emily smiled, leaning slightly forward. "But I imagine it must be exhausting dealing with so much improvisation. No guarantees, no certainties. It's hard for most people to survive in that scenario." Laura raised an eyebrow and smiled, as though Emily had just complimented her. "Exhausting? Sometimes. But it's also rewarding. I'm not afraid of uncertainties because they are part of growth. Besides, I'd rather live a life that challenges me than settle for something predictable." The group around them nodded in approval, and more questions about Laura's career began to emerge. As she answered with flawless balance, Emily could feel the heat rise in her face. The attention that had once been hers was now completely on the woman she was trying to undermine. James, observing from a distance, clearly saw Emily's discomfort and Laura's ease. It was impossible not to notice how Laura flowed between people, speaking with sincerity and without forced effort. He compared this to the environment he had been immersed in for years, one filled with appearances and empty conversations. For the first time in a long while, something inside him began to question his place in it all. Unable to bear it any longer, Emily decided to act even more aggressively. Grabbing a champagne flute, she walked over to the group again, and pretending to be at ease, commented, "I'd say this dress really reflects your new life, Laura. Pretty, but modest. It suits you." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Laura took a deep breath and smiled serenely, looking directly at Emily. "You're right, Emily. My dress is modest, but it reflects exactly who I am, someone who values essence more than appearances. And apparently it's working, because people seem genuinely interested in learning more about me." The reaction was immediate. Guests around them started commenting on Laura's elegance and authenticity, while Emily could only encourage a tense smile. With each attempt to undermine Laura backfiring, Emily's frustration grew visibly. As Laura moved away with some of the more important guests, James remained where he was, watching. He couldn't ignore the stark contrast between Laura's lightness and the superficiality that permeated everything around him. James walked alone through the castle's gardens, with the view of Liberty in the background, illuminated by the evening light. The party continued behind him, but the sounds of conversation and music seemed distant, muffled by his own thoughts. Laura's words from the night echoed in his mind. Every response she had given Emily, every calm gesture, seemed to carry a weight that he couldn't fully comprehend. There was something about her that had changed. It wasn't just the confidence she displayed, but the way she seemed to have found something he himself had lost long ago: purpose. Reaching the castle's lookout point, James leaned against the wrought iron railing, gazing at the city spread out before him. The vastness of the twinkling lights made him feel small. He thought about the life he had built, full of success and luxury, but every achievement seemed to have been made to please others. His family, Emily, the circles of power he now frequented. And where was he in the middle of it all? It was a question he hadn't asked himself in years. Lost in thought, a soft voice interrupted, pulling him from his reverie. He turned, surprised to see Laura standing a few meters behind him. She was standing in the breeze, her blue dress swaying lightly, her expression serene, but with a touch of curiosity and caution in her eyes. "Laura," he said, straightening up, stepping away from the railing, "I didn't know you were still here." "I needed some fresh air," she replied, taking a few steps closer, her eyes locking on the same view James had been contemplating. "It seems like you do, too." James smiled bitterly. "It's funny. Such a grand event, but all I can think about is how disconnected I feel from all of it." Laura didn't respond immediately. She stood in silence, giving him space to continue. It was a characteristic of hers that he had always admired, the ability to listen without rushing. "Sometimes I think about how I got here," James continued in a quiet voice. "I have everything I ever wanted, but why does it all feel so empty?" "Maybe because not everything you wanted was actually what you needed," Laura said calmly, without judgment. Her words hit James like a punch. He looked at her, realizing how different Laura was from the people around him. She wasn't trying to impress him or manipulate him. She was simply being honest. "I've never been as happy as I was when I was with you," he confessed finally, his voice almost hoarse. "It sounds cliché, but it's true. I lost myself trying to be someone I thought I should be." Laura took a deep breath, looking away for a moment. Though James's words were sincere, they reopened old wounds, and she knew she couldn't let herself be swept away by what he felt. "James, I believe you're being honest now," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "But you need to understand something. This isn't about us. It's about you." She looked at him with unwavering resolve. "You need to figure out who you really are, beyond what others expect of you. Until you do that, there's no point in talking about reconciliation." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. James absorbed her words, realizing that despite her gentle tone, there was an unshakable firmness to them. He knew she was right. He couldn't just go back to the past as if everything had stayed the same. "You're right," he finally spoke, his voice tinged with regret. "I just don't know where to start." Laura gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Start by being honest with yourself. That's the hardest part." The hall was at the height of its brilliance. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and the guests seemed immersed in the grandeur of the event. The most anticipated moment of the night had arrived, the wedding toast. Emily, stunning in her immaculate dress, took the microphone first. Her speech was polished, rehearsed, filled with words that praised the union between their families and the success they had achieved together. "And now my fiancé James has something to say," Emily concluded, handing the microphone to James with a smile that bordered on theatrical. James took the microphone with a distant expression. The sound of clapping and murmuring around him seemed to fade as he looked out at the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "This evening," his voice echoed in the hall, strong but with an underlying hesitation. "This is an important moment, not just for Emily and me, but for all of you here who believe in the union of tradition and ambition." Emily smiled with satisfaction, but James's tone shifted just slightly, and she was the first to notice it. "When I look at all this," he continued, gesturing toward the splendor around him, "I can't help but think about how much we've worked to build a life that seemed perfect. But sometimes, in the pursuit of perfection, we forget what truly matters, what makes us genuinely happy." The hall fell into silence. Some guests exchanged glances, sensing the uncertain direction the speech was taking. Emily, tense, kept her smile, but her fingers gripped the armrest of her chair tightly. James, however, seemed oblivious to the tension he was creating. "The truth is," he continued, his eyes now focused on a distant point, "I've spent a long time wondering if the life I was building was truly mine. And tonight, looking at all of you, I finally have an answer." He paused, the silence in the hall growing almost unbearable. Emily stood up abruptly, forcing a smile. "James, darling, maybe we should continue this in private, don't you think?" Her voice sounded more like a warning than a suggestion, but James shook his head firmly. "No, Emily. It's time we're honest, with everyone." He looked directly at her, his voice low but full of conviction. "I can't continue with this. I can't keep pretending to be someone I'm not, living a life of appearances." The shock was immediate. Murmurs began to spread through the guests, and Emily turned pale, her eyes flashing with anger and humiliation. "You're telling me this here, in front of everyone?" She advanced, her voice rising an octave. "After everything we've done together, after everything I sacrificed for us, you expose me like this, as if I'm the one responsible for your failures?" James remained firm, even as Emily's indignation grew. "This isn't about you, Emily. It's about me. I made choices to please everyone except myself, and I can't live like that anymore." "Ridiculous!" Emily shouted, her mask finally slipping. "You're a coward, James, an ingrate." She threw her champagne glass to the floor, the sound of the glass shattering echoing through the hall. Without saying another word, Emily turned on her heels and stormed out, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence and curious glances. Laura, who had been watching from a distance, felt a mixture of emotions. James's courage was undeniable, but she knew this was only the first step in a long journey. As the guests began to disperse, some clearly uncomfortable, others excited by the drama, James remained standing in the center of the hall, seemingly unaware of the chaos around him. The day dawned calmly, with the sun casting its golden rays over the narrow streets of Brooklyn, where time seemed to have slowed down. James parked his car at the entrance of the neighborhood, hesitating for a moment before stepping out. Dressed simply, almost unrecognizable to those who knew him as a businessman, he walked the old streets on foot, feeling like a stranger in a place that had once been his home. The colorful facades of the houses were the same, but now they seemed to carry a history he had never valued in his youth. James walked slowly, taking in every detail. The scent of fresh bread coming from the local bakery, the sound of children playing in the street, and the hum of casual conversations from neighbors. It was a stark contrast to the lavish events and cold environments he had been frequenting in recent years. When he reached the house where he had grown up, James stopped in front of the rusted gate. Memories flooded in like a tidal wave. The days spent playing soccer in the street, the afternoons helping his mother tend to the garden, the warm nights when he and Laura talked about their dreams beneath the stars. Touching the fence, he felt the weight of time and his choices. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "James, is it you?" Donna Marta, an elderly neighbor, appeared on the porch holding a bowl of dough. Her face lit up with recognition. "Yes, it's me, Donna Marta," James smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth at her welcome. "It's been so long," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron before opening the gate. "I never thought I'd see you back here. What brings you here?" James hesitated before answering, trying to find the right words. "Maybe nostalgia and the need to remember who I am." She nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. As they spoke, other neighbors began to appear, drawn by the news of his return. Each had a story to share, simple moments that James had forgotten but now seemed precious. He listened attentively, laughing at the memories and feeling a connection he hadn't experienced in years. While wandering through the neighborhood, James noticed a small building with children coming and going, carrying books. As he approached, he saw a modest sign that read, "Community Library, a place to dream." Intrigued, he entered quietly and was greeted by the sound of pages turning. The library was simple but well kept, with organized shelves and colorful murals on the walls. He saw Laura on the other side of the room, smiling at a group of children as she explained a story. James stepped back before she could notice him. The impact of seeing her there, so immersed in something meaningful, left him emotional. Later, he learned from one of the volunteers that Laura had started the project with her own resources, facing resistance and difficulties, but never giving up. Inspired, James decided to help anonymously, donating books, educational materials, and money for improvements to the library. Days later, Laura began to notice changes in the place. New books arrived, along with furniture and computers for the children to use. Though no one claimed responsibility for the donations, she suspected James. Her heart was torn between admiration and caution. Not long after, the confirmation came. James approached her one quiet day at the library and confessed his contribution, explaining that it was only a first step in repairing his mistakes. Laura, though touched, still kept a barrier. "That's admirable, James, but you don't need to do this for me. Do it for yourself and for these kids," she said sincerely. Determined to prove his changes were real, James made a decision that surprised everyone. He sold his luxury car and other assets to invest directly in the neighborhood. He funded improvements to the square, supported local small businesses, and organized community events. With each step, he felt a deeper connection to the place that had shaped his essence. James sat at a small wooden table in the neighborhood cafe, his eyes fixed on the door with a mix of expectation and nervousness. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the cozy space where local residents chatted casually. Unlike the luxurious restaurants he used to frequent, this place had a simplicity that reflected the new phase of his life. He checked his watch once more before lifting his gaze and seeing her walk in. Laura arrived on time, dressed casually, but still carrying her natural elegance. Her eyes scanned the place before landing on James's. He stood up, offering a hesitant smile. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "I'm curious to hear what you have to say," she replied, her tone controlled but without hostility. James signaled to the waitress and ordered 2 simple coffees, without the extravagant additives he had once considered essential. Laura watched the gesture, noticing the small changes in the man before her. Still, she couldn't help but feel skeptical. Changes like these required more than symbolic gestures. "I wanted this meeting because I think I owe you an expulsation," James began, stirring his coffee without really drinking it. "A lot has changed in my life these past few months, and I realized I've been living to meet expectations that weren't mine." "And you think this is something new?" Laura responded calmly, her voice tinged with irony. "This is something that's always been part of you, James, even when we were together." He looked at her, acknowledging the truth in her words. For a moment, his confident posture faltered. "I know. That's why I'm here." His voice was quiet but firm. "I don't want to justify the past. I want to learn from it. For the first time, I'm trying to understand who I am, outside of what others expect from me." Laura leaned slightly forward, her eyes searching for signs of authenticity in James. "And what have you discovered so far?" He took a deep breath before answering. "That I was lost. That the James you knew was more real than anything that came after. But I also know I can't go back in time. What I can do is change the present." She crossed her arms, studying him intently. "It's a nice speech, but do you really think these changes are permanent? Or is it just a phase driven by what's happened recently?" James looked at her with sincerity. "I don't know how to prove this to you, Laura. I can only promise that I'm committed, not for you or anyone else, but for myself. I'm selling what I don't need, investing in the neighborhood where I grew up, and trying to be a man who respects himself." Laura looked away for a moment, processing his words. There was something different in James, but years of pain made her cautious. "And what about us?" she finally asked. James shook his head, a melancholic smile forming on his lips. "I don't want to pressure you. I'm not here to ask you to come back to me. I just wanted to suggest that maybe we can start again, slowly, with patience and honesty." Laura laughed softly, but there was tenderness in her laughter. "Honesty and patience, words I never thought I'd hear from you." "I'm learning," he replied, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Maybe I'm not perfect, but I'm willing to try." The silence between them was heavy with meaning, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They both reflected on the weight of their shared history and the possibilities for the future. When Laura finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Let's start with one coffee at a time, James." James smiled, feeling a genuine sense of hope. It was a small step, but it was real. James and Laura walked side by side through the central square of Brooklyn, enveloped in a nostalgic atmosphere. The sounds of children playing, the murmurs of people, and the aroma of fresh churros coming from a nearby stall seemed to bring a piece of their youth back. Though the silence between them was frequent, it wasn't uncomfortable. Each step seemed to carry a memory that didn't need words. "Do you remember that newsstand?" James asked, pointing to a rusty metal structure in the corner of the square. "I used to buy comic books there every Saturday. You'd wait for me on that bench." Laura smiled, looking at the now empty bench, but marked by time. "And you'd always complain about how long it took to choose. I used to laugh, but I liked seeing you so excited. It was like each comic book was a little adventure." They continued walking, passing by an old carousel that still worked, though it seemed smaller than they both remembered. Laura stopped, watching the children spinning and laughing. "This is where you said you wanted to travel the world," she said, eyes fixed on the carousel. "That you didn't want to spend your whole life in just one place." James nodded, eyes focused on the ground. "I wanted so much to leave here that I forgot what it meant to be here." His voice was low, almost a whisper. After a few minutes, they reached the old school where they had met. The facade was worn, but still unmistakable. The rusted gate, the walls covered in graffiti, and the aligned windows brought a flood of memories. "It's strange how everything seems smaller now," Laura remarked, tilting her head. "But inside, everything felt so big. Every class, every break, every promise." James smiled wistfully. "This is where it all started, where I promised we'd do everything together." He looked at her from the corner of his eye, trying to gauge her reaction. "But I broke so many promises, Laura." She didn't respond immediately, continuing to observe the school as if seeing a projection of their youth. James felt the need to say more, to relieve the weight in his chest. "I chose the easier path, the pursuit of status, money, recognition." He sighed, hands in his pockets. "And in the end, I realized that none of that brought me the happiness I had when I was with you." Laura finally turned toward him, her eyes searching for sincerity in James's face. "I know you've changed, James. But the question is this who you are now, or just a reflection of what you think I want to see?" He met her gaze seriously. "It's who I want to be. And if that's enough, I want to prove it. Not just to you, but to myself." They stood there for a few moments, the weight of the past hanging between them, yet in a way that felt different, less heavy than before. Their shared memories of youth felt like distant echoes, and they both knew they couldn't go back to what they once had, but perhaps there was something worth moving toward now. After a while, they sat on the same bench where they had shared so many moments as teenagers. The wood was weathered, but it seemed to hold the echoes of their past conversations. "I also made a mistake in putting so many expectations on us," Laura admitted. "Maybe back then we expected too much from something that was still so fragile." James nodded. "Then let's start again. No promises we can't keep. No unrealistic expectations. Just honesty and patience." Laura smiled, though it was a restrained smile. There was warmth in it. "Honesty and patience. I can accept that. But James, you need to understand that it won't be easy or quick." He took her hand, but without pushing. "I know, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." In that moment, as the sun began to set, both of them felt they were taking the first step towards something new. It wasn't just reconciliation. It was a conscious choice to face the past and build a future based on truth. James parked his car on the corner near the central square, where Laura was waiting for him with a look of mild curiosity. It was a sunny day, and the scent of blooming jacarandas filled the air. He had something hidden behind his body, which only heightened her anticipation. "What are you planning?" Laura asked, raising an eyebrow, both suspicious and amused. "Close your eyes," he requested, his smile a mix of mischievousness and sincerity. Laura hesitated, but after a theatrical sigh, she complied. When she felt something cold touch her hands, she opened her eyes to find a vanilla ice cream with caramel sauce and crystallized nuts. Her laughter was immediate. "How did you remember this?" she asked, surprised, holding the ice cream. "You used to order that same flavor every week when we went to that ice cream shop near the school. I thought it would bring back some of that memory," James replied, watching her with a twinkle in his eye. Laura took a small bite of the ice cream and smiled. "It's still my favorite, and I'll admit that was a good touch." Gestures like this began to happen more often. They weren't grand declarations, but simple acts that showed James's effort to reconnect with her in a genuine way. The man who now walked beside Laura seemed closer to the boy she had known than the cold businessman he had become. Over time, James's changes began to extend beyond personal interactions. He invested more resources into the community library, expanding the space and adding a dedicated area for after-school programs and art workshops. Laura, impressed by his dedication, became more involved in the project. Together, they began planning initiatives, from children's art exhibitions to reading events for the entire community. "This is becoming something much bigger than I imagined," Laura said during one of the meetings in the small office they had set up in the library. "It's because we're working together now," James replied without hesitation. "And that's how I want to continue, working to build something real, something that makes a difference." Laura smiled, but there was still a trace of caution in her eyes. She knew James's intentions were sincere, but she wasn't ready to let go of the years of pain and disappointment so easily. Still, something was changing inside her. It was hard to deny that he seemed to be transforming for reasons deeper than just winning her back. One evening, after a community event, Laura found James sitting alone in the park, watching the children play. She approached and sat down next to him. "It looks like you're finding yourself here, huh?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Maybe I never really found myself before," he replied, looking at her. "And as much as I want you to be a part of this, you need to know that this transformation isn't dependent on you. It's something I needed to do, even if you weren't here." His words touched something in Laura. For the first time, she felt that he was genuinely changing for himself, not just for others. This realization began to open a space in her heart for something she had locked away a long time ago. That night, as they walked back to their homes, James hesitated for a moment before saying goodbye. Laura noticed, and before he could speak, she said, "James, I want you to know that I'm willing to try. Not everything at once, but I want to see where this can take us." His eyes brightened with gratitude and hope. "That's all I can ask for, one step at a time." James began his days in a simpler way, unlike the fast-paced, ostentatious routine that had once defined his life. Now the alarm clock was replaced by the first rays of sunlight that poured through the windows of his modest home in Brooklyn. He prepared his own breakfast, using ingredients bought at the local market, where he often stopped to chat with the vendors and neighbors. This new rhythm not only reconnected him with his roots, but also brought him a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. Part of his time was dedicated to a project he had recently started, a scholarship fund for promising young people in the community. Inspired by the struggles many faced, he wanted to create real opportunities for these kids to dream beyond the limits imposed by their socio-economic conditions. The community library, which he and Laura had expanded, had become the center of activities for the project. Workshops, mentoring, and educational gatherings began to transform the community's perception of their future. One day, while handing out flyers about the scholarships, James met Jorge, a 17-year-old who dreamed of becoming an engineer but worked as a delivery boy to help support his family. Hearing Jorge's story, James felt even more motivated to make a difference. "This scholarship isn't just to pay for college," James explained. "It's to open doors that seemed closed. You deserve this chance, Jorge, and I'll do whatever I can to help." As his initiatives gained momentum, James also started confronting issues he had avoided for years. He revisited memories of the choices that had led him to prioritize status and money, distancing himself from who he really was. Walking through the neighborhood, talking to neighbors, and remembering moments with his family helped him face the regrets that had once seemed unbearable. Part of this process involved a drastic cut in his social circle. James distanced himself from superficial friendships that had once revolved around selfish interests and cold transactions. In return, he began to surround himself with people who shared his vision of community and purpose. However, these changes didn't come without challenges. Rumors began to spread around the neighborhood. Some residents, suspicious of his sudden transformation, suggested that James was still involved in dubious business practices from his past. "He's just here to clean up his image," some said. These words reached Laura through a casual conversation at the library. "Do you really believe he's changed?" a volunteer asked while cataloging books. "Or do you think all this is just to cover up something bigger?" Laura, who had been closely following James's efforts, felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't believe the rumors, but doubts began to creep into her mind. After all, as much as she wanted to trust him, the scars of the past were still there. Laura couldn't shake off the words she had overheard earlier. The rumors about James seemed to echo in her mind, mixing with the memories of past disappointments. She wanted to believe in his transformation, but the fear of being deceived again left her restless. The sound of a message on her phone interrupted her thoughts. It was Sarah inviting her for a coffee. Laura didn't hesitate. She needed to vent to someone. Not long after, the two were sitting in a cozy cafe in the heart of the neighborhood. Sarah, as always, was direct and practical, qualities Laura appreciated and at times feared. "So, do you think he might be hiding something?" Sarah asked, swirling her spoon in her coffee with more force than necessary. "I don't know," Laura sighed, resting her face in her hand. "I want to believe he's changed, but what if all of this is just a facade? I don't want to go through all that again." Sarah took a sip of her coffee and looked at Laura with a firm gaze. "Listen, I understand your caution, and you have every right to be doubtful. But James has shown real effort, hasn't he? It doesn't seem like he's just talking, he's taking action. My suggestion is simple: talk to him, be honest. But Laura, if something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts." Laura nodded slowly. It was sound advice, but confronting him directly would take more courage than she was ready to admit. Still, she knew she couldn't put off the conversation any longer. That very night, she decided to go to James's house. When he opened the door, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. Laura stood there, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. James invited her in, clearly concerned. They sat down in the living room, and Laura didn't waste time. "James, I heard some rumors today," she said, her voice firm, though she was struggling to remain calm. "They say you're still involved with shady businesses. I need to know that everything you're doing is real, that this isn't just a front." The surprise on James's face was evident. He fell silent for a moment, as if processing what she had just said. When he spoke, his voice was filled with hurt. "Do you think I'd do that, Laura, after everything I've been trying to change?" "I don't know, James," she said, her gaze shifting to the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "That's why I'm here. I want to believe in you. But I need proof. I need to know that I can trust you." The weight of her words hit James hard. He took a deep breath, trying to control his frustration. "It's painful to hear that, but I understand. I created an image of myself in the past that gives reason for these doubts now. And if it's transparency you need, I'll give it to you." The next day, James took Laura to the office where he emcearaged the community projects. He showed her detailed documents, records of donations, contracts and financial statements that proved the legitimacy of his investments. He explained each line, each number, patiently answering all her questions. Laura examined everything carefully, while James stayed by her side, tense. When she finished, she closed the last folder and looked him in the eye. "I'm sorry for doubting you," she said, her voice low but full of regret. "You didn't have to do all this, but you did, and that means a lot." James smiled, relieved. "It wasn't easy hearing your doubts, but I know they come from a legitimate place. What matters now is that we're being honest with each other." With the doubts cleared up, they returned to their plans for the community, now with renewed mutual trust. The mornings in the neighborhood had taken on a new energy. The local market was livelier, children played in the newly renovated square, and the hum of excited conversations filled the air. Laura, with paintbrush in hand and splashes of color on her apron, was at the center of this transformation. She had decided to use her art as a tool for inclusion and culture, organizing a series of open exhibitions in the central square. James, always by her side, helped set up the canvases and adjust the lighting to highlight the works. "Do you think it will attract a lot of people?" Laura asked, watching the last pieces of art being placed on display. "I'm sure," James replied, handing her a list of residents who had confirmed their attendance. "It seems like everyone's curious to see how you've turned simple stories into something so beautiful." The exhibitions weren't just art displays, they were representations of the lives and stories of the people from the neighborhood. Laura had encouraged both young and old to express their perspectives through paintings, drawings, and even sculptures made from recycled materials. The result was a mosaic of creativity that reflected the diversity and potential of the community. That evening, the square was packed. Residents walked among the artworks, talking, laughing, and taking photos. Local journalists appeared to cover the event, and some well-known artists from the city came to appreciate Laura's work. James, watching from a distance, felt a growing sense of pride. Laura's strength, her dedication to the community, and her ability to transform lives through art were undeniable. "It looks like you created something bigger than you imagined," he said, approaching her as she spoke with a group of children who had exhibited their first drawings. "It wouldn't have been possible without you," Laura replied, smiling genuinely. "You believed in me, and that makes all the difference." The artistic initiatives didn't just revitalize the neighborhood, they also started attracting attention from outside. Small businesses began to spring up to cater to the growing foot traffic, and curious tourists began to visit to see the new Brooklyn. The social impact was clear, and people began to associate these changes with the tireless efforts of Laura and James. During a community meeting, Donna Marta, one of the oldest residents, stood up to speak. "I haven't seen this neighborhood so alive since I was a girl," she said, her voice warm with appreciation. "What Laura and James have done for us is more than just help. They've given us hope. We are grateful for that." The room erupted into applause, and Laura tried to hold back tears as James discreetly squeezed her hand in support. As the neighborhood blossomed, the relationship between Laura and James also found new roots. They started to cherish the small moments together, a morning walk in the square, a shared coffee at the library, or evenings spent planning new projects in their makeshift office. These simple but meaningful moments strengthened the emotional bond between them, founded on respect and partnership. One evening, as they walked back home, Laura stopped and looked up at the starry sky. "Have you ever thought about what our future might be like?" she asked, breaking the silence. James, surprised, smiled. "I've thought about it more than you'd imagine, but I want it to be a future where we both keep doing what we love, together. Something that's ours, but also for the world around us." Laura nodded, and a small smile curved her lips. "Then maybe it's time we start planning, but this time without rushing. Let's build it carefully." The community event was in full swing. The small stage set up in the central square was surrounded by residents and guests who applauded the progress of the neighborhood. Laura was at the center of attention, presenting a new cultural program that would encourage young artists to showcase their talents. James, a little further in the background, watched with pride, preferring to let Laura shine in that moment. Everything seemed perfect until an unexpected figure appeared in the crowd. Emily, impeccably dressed with her haughty posture, walked toward the stage, drawing curious glances and murmurs. Laura paused her speech, visibly confused, while James stepped forward, feeling the weight of a troubling premonition. "Good afternoon, everyone," Emily's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Sorry for the interruption, but I thought it was important to bring something to light that everyone here deserves to know, especially about James." The square fell silent, and all eyes turned toward her. Emily raised an envelope with papers, as if she had prepared everything for this moment. "This man, whom you are celebrating, has a past he conveniently forgot to mention. During his time as a businessman, James was involved in financial fraud and manipulation of funds. These documents," she held up the papers, "are proof that he embezzled money while running his old company." A murmur of unease spread through the crowd. Laura looked at James, expecting him to deny it immediately, but he stood still, his face tense as he processed the unexpected blow. "This isn't true," James said finally, his voice firm but filled with contained rage. "Emily, you know these accusations are false. What are you trying to do here?" "I'm trying to protect these people," Emily retorted with a cold smile. "They have the right to know who the man leading this project really is." The murmurs turned into louder discussions. Some residents began openly questioning James's intentions, while others turned to Laura, waiting for her to take a stand. The ground seemed to disappear beneath her feet. All the efforts, all the moments she had shared with James suddenly felt uncertain. Later, in the makeshift office of the library, Laura confronted James, her voice trembling with a mix of pain and indignation. "Please, tell me this isn't true, James, that everything we've done hasn't been built on lies." "It's not true!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with desperation. "I've never done anything illegal, Laura. Emily is doing this out of revenge because she couldn't stand seeing me move on. You need to believe me." Laura looked away, her eyes welling up with tears. "I want to believe you, but this is too much. I need time, James. I need to process all of this." She left, leaving James alone in the office. The silence that followed was almost deafening. For the first time in months, he felt the crushing weight of loneliness. Sponsors began pulling their support from the projects, and some residents, fearing the scandal would tarnish the neighborhood's reputation, began to distance themselves. The hard work James had put into everything seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. Still, he refused to back down. In a meeting with the few remaining allies, James declared with determination, "I will prove my innocence. No matter how long it takes or what it costs, I won't give up on what we've built here. And I will do it the right way." Though doubt and fear weighed on him, James knew he couldn't allow himself to falter. Emily's accusations had shaken everything, but they would not destroy his resolve. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for the neighborhood and the people who trusted him. The days following Emily's accusations were the hardest James had ever faced. The community library, once a symbol of hope, now felt empty, as did the trust of the people around him. But he refused to let her words destroy what he had built. Determined to prove his innocence, James reached out to former colleagues who knew his integrity, as well as a trusted accountant with whom he meticulously reviewed all his financial transactions from previous years. The investigation revealed something he had suspected. The documents Emily had presented were well-crafted forgeries. Altered records and forged signatures made it clear that she had orchestrated the entire thing to tarnish his reputation. James felt a mixture of relief and indignation upon realizing just how far she had gone for revenge. Armed with evidence, he called a meeting with the community leaders and sponsors, presenting every piece of proof and answering their questions with clarity. "I know this situation has caused doubts," he said, his voice firm but emotional. "But I never once betrayed your trust, and now I hope this will be enough to show you the truth." The serious faces in the room began to soften as the clarity of the situation took hold. When he finished speaking, there was a brief moment of silence before Donna Marta stood up and began clapping. Soon, others followed suit, and the sound of approval filled the room. James felt a wave of relief, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. He knew that, even though he was innocent, he would have to continue proving his commitment. With the truth revealed, the sponsors who had pulled their support began to return, and the neighborhood came back to life. The trust of the residents was restored, and James, more than ever, felt connected to the place he had come from. However, there was still one absence that weighed on his heart: Laura. Laura had been following everything from a distance, but what impressed her wasn't just the evidence James presented, it was the dignity with which he faced the crisis. He could have hidden, but he chose to confront it head-on without resorting to retaliation or abandoning his principles. That attitude made her see that the man in front of her was no longer the one who had prioritized status in the past. One afternoon, Laura decided to seek him out. She found him in the garden of the library, organizing an event for the children. James looked up in surprise when he saw her, but his face softened as a small, relieved smile crossed his lips. "Can we talk?" Laura asked, and he nodded, leading her to a quieter corner. She took a deep breath before speaking. "James, I was unfair to you. I let my insecurities and the weight of the past make me doubt you when all you've been trying to do is change." "Laura," he began, but she raised her hand, signaling him to let her finish. "You didn't just face everything with honesty. You did it without ever losing sight of what was right. That showed me that you've become the man I always hoped you would be. And for that, I owe you an apology." James looked at her for a moment, his eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and emotion. "I just wanted you to know that my transformation was never for you. It was for the man I needed to be. But Laura, having you here now means more than I can say." They embraced, a simple gesture, but one filled with unspoken promises. Their reconnection wasn't just emotional, it was practical. Together, they began planning new projects for the neighborhood, with even bigger ideas, including the creation of a cultural center that would house art, music, and education. "This place has changed our lives, James. Now it's our turn to give something even bigger back to it," Laura said, as they discussed the next steps. This time, their dreams were shared, but with a solid foundation of respect and trust. For Laura and James, the future was no longer an abstraction. It was something they were ready to face together. The sound of children playing in the central square was accompanied by the hum of residents chatting excitedly. Brooklyn had become more than just a revitalized neighborhood. It was now a vibrant, thriving community, a reflection of the hard work of James and Laura. Watching the bustle around them, they sat hand in hand on the same bench where so many promises had been made in the past. "It feels right, doesn't it?" Laura remarked, looking around with a peaceful smile. "More than that, it feels like coming home," James said, gently squeezing her hand. "For a long time I searched for something that has always been here. The decision to move back to the neighborhood had come without hesitation. Both of them felt that their roots belonged here, and to build a solid future, they needed to be where their journeys had begun. The house they chose was simple, with a small garden out front, but Laura could already see the potential in every corner. James, in turn, was committed to restoring it with his own hands, a gesture that symbolized his desire to rebuild not just a home, but an authentic life. As they organized their move, they continued to expand their community initiatives. The library now housed a vocational training program for young people, while the new cultural center they had helped establish offered classes in art, music, and technology. Laura led the art workshops, while James handled the administrative side, ensuring that every resource was used in the best possible way. Their teamwork not only strengthened the projects, but also deepened their bond. "I didn't expect it to be this rewarding," James confessed one night as they worked late at the library. "Because now you see the results of something built with purpose," Laura replied without looking up from a mural she was painting with the children. "This is what I always wanted for us." The changes in their lives culminated in a special moment. Surrounded by friends and residents who had become their family, James and Laura decided to formalize their union in an intimate wedding held in the same square where so many memories had been made. The ceremony was simple but full of emotion. Flowers picked from the community gardens decorated the makeshift altar, and the music was provided by a group of young people from the neighborhood. As Laura walked down the aisle, wearing a light dress and adorned with a radiant smile, everyone present felt the depth of the moment. This wasn't just a wedding, it was the celebration of two lives that had transformed to find a greater purpose. "I never imagined I'd be here with you, living something so real," Laura said during her vows, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I never imagined I'd find the best of myself in someone like you," James responded, holding her hands firmly. The tears in the eyes of their guests reflected the sincerity of the moment. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange, James and Laura danced for the first time as husband and wife, surrounded by the people who had believed in them, even during their most difficult moments. The days that followed their wedding were filled with new dreams and hard work. They began planning partnerships with other neighborhoods, expanding the reach of their community initiatives and inspiring others to do the same. However, even amid the growth of their projects, Laura and James always made time for themselves, cherishing simple and meaningful moments that kept them connected. Over time, Brooklyn became a model for how determination and collaboration can transform a community. But more importantly, it became the place where two people learned to value love, authenticity, and the lasting impact they could create together.